Actually, he replied or he didn't.
There you go.
Welcome to tonight's forum event, Corporate Fraud and Rattled Investors. My purpose here tonight is to introduce our moderator. I'm Kerry Colanisi. I won't be the moderator, but I'm pleased to introduce Ira Jackson, who is the current and first president of the Arthur M. Blank Foundation in Atlanta, Georgia, who will be our moderator tonight. Ira is a distinguished alumnus of Harvard College and the John F. Kennedy School of Government. In 1998, he was recognized with our Alumni Achievement Award here at the Kennedy School for his distinguished leadership in the public and private sectors. But he is also, in addition to a leader in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, he's made an impact right here. During his tenure as the assistant dean for the Kennedy School, he was responsible for creating this forum in which we sit tonight. More recently, he served as the director of our Center for Business and Government here at the Kennedy School, where he brought his creativity, his energy, and his enthusiasm to crystallizing the mission of that center and promoting our teaching and our research and outreach on issues related to business and government. We're delighted to have him back here. He tells me that in his spare time he's completing a book with the title of Restoring Trust and Confidence in Corporate America, an apt title for tonight's discussion, and a person who I have a great privilege of introducing tonight. And I'll turn it to you, Ira. Thank you.
Great to be back and to be asked back, and a privilege to be here with four distinguished panelists who are going to help us illuminate and reach for tentative answers, at least, to questions like the following. How do we restore public trust and investor confidence in private enterprise? How does Wall Street regain the mantle of financial integrity in the wake of Enron, WorldCom, ImClone, Global Crossing? How does Main Street recover from its losses on Wall Street? $7 trillion and counting. Who can it trust to give advice, not hype, after being burned so badly and cynically manipulated for so long by so many analysts and investment bankers? Why should employees trust their employers when, after so many companies left their workers sinking while throwing out a golden lifeboat to the skippers who navigated the ship so poorly? And how did it all come to this? Who did this to us? Or did we do it to ourselves? Why is it that the longest and strongest period of economic growth in the history of civilization should have ended so shamefully? CEOs falling from their pedestals and some ending up in prisons, regulators falling down on the job, seemingly captive to the very industries they were sworn to police, the entire accounting profession on the defensive, and so many, too many, elected corporate boards exposed as compromised cronies and silent puppets of management. Congress, of course, has taken some steps, some very tough steps to correct and control for the fraud and abuses. The SEC is talking tough, and the stock exchanges have adopted strict new laws of conduct. There's more transparency and more disclosure and certainly more criminal investigations. But are these actions enough? Can these modest reforms do the job, or are we missing some major pieces of the puzzle? And what about the law of unintended consequences? Might some of these reforms actually end up doing more harm than good, throttling innovation for the benefit of certainty? And what about corporate ethics and behavior? If we can't legislate morality, how do we bring about changes at the heart of the corporation and encourage CEOs and boards to manage responsibly and not just to the numbers and the expectations of the street? Well, to help us illuminate the mysteries and to shed some considerable wisdom on these and other topics, we have four of the nation's most prominent and respected experts to guide us. They all have deep knowledge of financial markets, regulatory mechanisms, and public policy. Let me introduce them to you. John Corzine was elected to his first term in the United States Senate in November of 2000 after a long and successful career as an investment banker. Although, as he told us over dinner, he's more proud and more prone to talk about having been a captain in the Marine Corps than CEO of Goldman Sachs in the current context. Born in Willys Station, Illinois, Senator Corzine graduated Phi Beta Kappa from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and received his MBA from the University of Chicago. Settling in New Jersey, he went to work as a bond trader at Goldman Sachs, where he quickly became a partner and then co-chairman and co-CEO of arguably the world's most respected investment bank. Senator Corzine's private sector expertise and experience has put him at the forefront of a number of major economic and regulatory issues confronting the Congress. He's a member of the Senate Budget Committee, the Senate Banking, Housing and Urban Affairs Committee, and the Joint Economic Committee of the Congress. And despite being a first-term freshman legislator, he's already left his mark on a number of important pieces of legislation, ranging from strengthening the SEC and accounting standards to changing 401k procedures and ensuring a governmental equity stake in the government's bailout of the airline industry. Catherine Kinney is president of the New York Stock Exchange. Since January, she's also served as co-chief operating officer and executive vice chairman. She's also a member of the Office of the Chairman and co-chairs the New York Stock Exchange's management and operating committees. Ms. Kinney is a 28-year veteran, violating the child labor laws of the New York Stock Exchange, and has served in the trenches as well as in the executive suite. She has overseen floor trading operations, technology, and the exchange's competitive position and relations with listed companies. She's a member of a number of corporate boards in addition to serving on the board of the NYSE. She's an honors graduate of Iona College and completed the advanced management program at the Harvard Business School. Richard Breden is a former chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, having been appointed by President George Herbert Walker Bush and unanimously confirmed by the United States Senate. Previously, he was a top economic and financial advisor to the president and was one of the principal architects of the bailout and restructuring of the savings and loan industry and the creator of the Resolution Trust Corporation. In the mid-90s, Mr. Breden served as chairman of the worldwide financial practice of Coopers & Lybrand. He specializes in turning around and consulting to firms in crisis as a result of fraud and mismanagement. He's a busy man in a high-growth sector. In July, he was appointed by the U.S. District Court in Manhattan to monitor WorldCom during litigation brought by the SEC. Batting cleanup. Kenneth Birch is Director of Corporate Governance for Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association, College Retirement Equities Fund, TIAA-CREF for short. For those of you not familiar with TIAA-CREF, all of us who have been or are now on the faculty or employed by this or any other university in the world have our 401k pensions invested in this organization, which has $275 billion of assets under management, is a leading financial services organization, a major institutional investor, and the world's largest private retirement system. As Director of Corporate Governance, Ken coordinates TIAA-CREF's corporate assessment program, which reviews structures and practices of portfolio companies and recommends how TIAA-CREF votes on shareholder resolutions. So that's our talented lineup on an important and complicated set of issues facing our economy and our nation. Please join me in welcoming Senator Corzine, Kathy Kinney, Richard Breden, and Kenneth Birch. To start things off, let me start with Senator Corzine, if I might. The collapse of Enron, the bankruptcy of Arthur Andersen, the rout on Wall Street, and the ensuing crisis of confidence in capitalism looks either like the perfect storm or a systemic breakdown. There's been some mopping up now that the storm has subsided. My question for you is it enough? Or are we misreading the forensics in this case? And might something more radical by way of restructuring be necessary to save capitalism from itself?
Wow. We have a couple of years to go through this in class.
As long as you want.
Let me start with the acknowledgement that all individuals now must do with regard to transparency. I am a walking bundle of conflicts, a politician, which has a stake in the legislation that's been passed, a former CEO, which I do like to emphasize that I was a sergeant in the Marine Corps now when I'm on the stump. Either that, I went to the University of Chicago as opposed to Harvard, so there was all kinds of conflicts, even on the Board of Trustees there, so could get into different views on it. But there are a few conflicts in my background that sometimes can end up leading to people challenging issues. I think we more have dealt with a storm than a systemic failure or breakdown long-term in our capitalistic system. I believe that there's a failure to have fully embraced the checks and balances that were necessary in a system where markets are relatively amoral, not immoral, but amoral. And when those situations exist, I think you need to put in legitimate checks and balances. One of the great realities and reactions to the problems in the 20s and 30s was the securities laws, which put together the SEC and a whole body of law that provided for checks and balances, but I don't think we kept a pace with the system, and we left some big gaping holes. For instance, we required for companies to have public statements audited by independent public accountants, but we had no oversight of the accounting industry in that process. We had peer reviews. Might be good for colleges, but I'm not so sure it's so good for those who are operating in a world where profits and the ability to make profits are case. So I think that a lot of the steps that have been taken with regard to both legislation, the SEC, the New York Stock Exchange, NASD, are very positive ingredients. You know, the reality is, I grew up in a small town of about 8,000 people. We had 14 or 15 cops in that town because the lowest common denominator of behavior was not always perfect. And you needed to have people on the street corner to make sure that society's rules were somewhat provided for. At Goldman Sachs, when I was the CEO, we had a compliance department and an internal audit department that you actually depended on to make sure that the rules of the road of what you were trying to enforce with regard to standards and policies were actually implemented. And so I think that common sense tells me we needed some checks and balances and updating of those, and I think we've taken some very healthy steps along that line. I think all of that, though, begs one question, which I think is equally important, and I hope that is being discussed among academia, and I think needs to be talked about in society general, is that the tone at the top, the leadership, which is not something that's subject to legislation, needs to be reemphasized. People, capital, and reputation are the important ingredients, fundamental ingredients of what make for great companies. And people and capital, while difficult to replace, can be in an economic context. Reputation can't be. And we have to get back to an economic system that values that as much as it does what earnings per share are. And I think that there's a whole element of effort that needs to be brought to bear to make sure that we're doing the right things along those lines.
Well, let me use the prerogative of the chair to to pursue that observation. Warren Buffett has said that it takes 20 years to build a corporate reputation, 5 minutes to destroy it. What would your prescription or short list of suggestions be to the 11,000 CEOs on publicly traded companies who are members of the New York Stock Exchange in terms of, beyond complying with your new laws, what else do they need to do?
Well, they have to practice what they preach, and you're going to start with CEO compensation and executive compensation. I think there needs to be a demonstration that what's important is the shareholders' success, not their personal success, that providing products and services on a high-quality basis are what companies are about, not earnings per share. And so that the things that you have to lead your organization to believe need to be those things that are fundamentally valuable. If you serve your client well, I'm actually repeating some of the missions and the business principles of Goldman Sachs, which I was taught by people who were a lot smarter than me, who preceded me. But if you serve your clients well, profits will follow. And I believe that in the end, those kinds of principles need to be how one actually leads an organization, and you determine and send those messages by who you reward and how you reward people within an organization.
Thank you. Catherine Kinney, the New York Stock Exchange and the NASD both have responded aggressively by establishing tough new rules that limit the likelihood that sins of recent magnitude will reoccur. My question or questions for you: how did a system that was widely viewed as the best in the world only recently deteriorate so rapidly? Why didn't the checks and safeguards work to enforce some discipline before the meltdown? And what issues remain unresolved and might therefore leave us vulnerable to a future shock of similar proportions?
Wow. Well, I would step back and say that we've had an opportunity to look at this clearly over the last several months, and I think you're correct that we don't see, we would agree with John, we don't see this as a systemic problem, but rather a series of very bad, isolated situations. And I think clearly everyone's very angry. A lot of things went wrong by a lot of people at the same time, whether that was lawyers or accountants, corporate executives, boards, and everybody is looking for the responsible party here, and there are lots of them. I don't think there's any group, but many groups, all of whom can claim, unfortunately, some credit for what's happened. And I think the question also you asked about, how did this go so wrong? And I can't help but think that we've been blindsided on a couple of issues in the last year. And that was, who would have thought terrorists could, drive 2 planes into the World Trade Center? And who would have thought that those 2 buildings could come down? And who would have thought that corporate America and CEOs would not have told us the truth in the disclosures that they made, either to the SEC, to us, in their annual reports? So I think that it's really a question of this terrible failure, but I think it's also, we believe, very narrow, and as I said, it's deep within the organizations that have suffered, and the employees in those organizations that have suffered badly, but we think it's a reasonably narrow set of circumstances which can be dealt with and will be dealt with. Some, I hope, very strongly. Clearly people who have done very bad things, I think everybody would agree should go to jail, should spend some time thinking about all the things that they have done to the various shareholders who trusted them with their money. And clearly, the legislature, the SEC, and the New York Stock Exchange have adopted very quickly rules that we think, as John said, raise the level of the checks and balances. I don't think anyone in this room should conclude from any of this that we're going to prevent corporate fraud in the future. I don't think that that is not the goal here. The goal is really to restore the confidence to set apart the people who have done something very terrible here, and to put the others to the other side, to raise the level of checks and balances, to restore the corporate boards to the job that they were supposed to be responsible for, and that was looking out for the shareholder. And I think if we have any contribution to make as a group, it's that we can redirect and refocus people who have a responsibility here, whether it's the CEO, the board, or in some cases the shareholders themselves, to put them in more proactive positions and engage them in each of their roles more effectively with the kinds of checks and balances that have been worked on between the government and private enterprise. And it's not any one of those, but all of those together, which I think will have the effect of doing what we hope, and that is beginning to restore investor confidence. I think there are some things, however, that still are undone and will need attention. And I think everyone here on this panel will be contributing to that going forward. You know, it's clear that there is still a lot of work to be done in the accounting profession. Oversight boards will be developed, accounting rules will be revamped, but I don't know how many students in this room would think of taking up the accounting profession as a goal or a job, but smart people, bright people, committed, engaged people need to be focused on this profession because it is going to need a lot of thought and attention. I think John talked about his executive compensation. I won't dwell on that. There is one other rule, though, that I think...
But just to
Yes,
just
I'm sorry.
educate those of us who aren't as knowledgeable as you and the senator, what legislation, what elements of legislation have spoken to executive compensation, if any? And before you just pass by it, many have observed, it's repeated in this week's Business Week, that executive to entry-level compensation has grown from a ratio of 40 to 1 20 years ago in America to in excess of 500 to 1. What, if any, mechanism is likely to curb that excess? It's not legislation, is it? Or regulation or self-policing by the NYSE or the NASD?
I would offer two things that I think are both in the legislation and in our own proposals. The first is that in the composition of a majority of independent directors, you also are going to have, for the first time, compensation committees that are made up of completely and totally independent directors. And I think that's a very important change for companies. So the CEO's compensation, evaluation, and all of those things will be heard and decided upon by independent directors of the company. So I think that's one very important change. And I think the second is the issue of stock options. And what we have proposed in conjunction and working with the SEC and the NASD is that all equity option plans will have to be voted on by shareholders. Now, this has two parts. The first is that for the first time, shareholders will be asked to vote on these compensation plans regardless of whether they, where they sit within the company. It doesn't matter who's getting the stock options, you will have to vote on these plans. But I think the second very important thing for everybody in this audience to take away is that it's empowering the shareholder, whether you're an individual shareholder or whether you are participating as part of TIA-CREF's plan. It's really empowering the shareholder to become involved in corporate governance. You can come here tonight, but you're only going to sit in your chair, and you're going to leave here, I hope, and pick up those proxies that you get, and you're going to vote on a variety of matters that are important to the governance of those companies, including the compensation of all the senior officers and the employees who are receiving stock options. So I think these are two very important changes. To be sure, there will be more, but these, I think, are two very important ones. But they involve everyone in this room and not just the board.
I don't want to preempt the other folks. Interconnection between disclosure in the most readily readable pieces of information about companies, annual reports of what executive compensation is, along with the reputational issue. Institutional investors need to express themselves with regard to, and investors in general, with regard to executive compensation. And it needs to be one of those standards that I think the marketplace needs to provide some discipline to as well.
Richard Breden, you've been there, done that, seen it all or most of it before. How do we do a better job going forward so that we don't see this ugly movie ever again? Every major institution has taken some actions, but what needs to be done so that it doesn't just sound good, but it actually brings home solid and sustained changes going forward? Take your pick, whether it's the White House where you work, the SEC which you chaired, the NASD, the FASB, or the business community itself. Who needs to do what to restore public trust and investor confidence?
Well, thanks. All of the above have a role to play. Let me first, before answering that question, just say I was very privileged to attend the Harvard Law School and graduated in 1975. You didn't have at the Kennedy School this magnificent building then, but I just want to say how pleased I am to have a chance to be back on campus. It's always a treat. I also enjoy having a chance, and I see an awful lot of young faces in the room, and think that the subject of ethics and ethics in American business is a topic that in which we all, no matter where we work and what our profession is, but as citizens of America, we all have a tremendous stake in that. And I think it's an issue that you should feel every right to be engaged in and vocal on and participate in as we try and find our way to the best system in this country for how we meld public ownership and private management of the great businesses that exist in this country. I have maybe a little different perspective, and I guess since the SEC is all about disclosure and John disclosed his conflicts, I better disclose a few of mine. I used to lock people up for a living. And I've gone straight now. I mean, although if you really need to spend time, speak to me afterwards. I was very proud of the time I spent in law enforcement. The SEC is truly a unique institution, and like John, I have a little conflict because most days of the week I'm a free market Republican. But the greatest privilege and honor of my life was serving as chairman of a New Deal federal agency called the SEC. And I have to say that it is, in my mind, one of the, I don't know how much any of you have looked at the history of the SEC, but it is truly a remarkable exercise in public policy from its very creation and down to the present time. It was born out of a lot of adversity. But it's very, very unusual as a government agency. Now, when I was there, our budget was smaller than the budget for military bands. So you had a big job, but not a lot to work with to do it. And thanks to Senator Corzine and others, there's going to be more resources to the SEC, and I mention that because I hope many of you, if you're thinking about a career in public policy or an experience in public policy, the SEC has got some slots for some new hiring, and I hope a lot of you here in this room will think about calling up the SEC, and when you're through here, going down and spending the time, because I can promise you that you could never, ever, ever work anywhere that will give you a more rewarding sense of contributing to the development of capitalism, but also to capitalism with American values. What I think partly makes the SEC so unique is it, a lot of government agencies exist to build bridges or process transfer payments, and I had a lousy job as chairman of the SEC because most heads of government agencies in Washington get to go around and they give out grants, they give away money. So imagine how popular they are. I mean, that's even before you get to be a senator. So
You've got to have a straight man.
You're in the business a lot of time in government of saying yes to people's desires for projects and buildings and contracts and so on. The SEC, your job is to say no. You are the Grinch who stole those extra EPS. You're the Grinch who stole people's favorite wacky accounting interpretation. You are the Grinch who made them put the value of their stock options in the proxies so that the institutional investors and other people can see what's going on. But it's a unique agency because it is really, when you cut through everything, though it creates and promulgates a lot of rules, the SEC at its base is about values. And we don't have many government agencies that are in the values business, although arguably all of American government is founded on, like our democracy, on our sense of values. But the SEC is not morally ambivalent. It exists to pursue, and has always existed to pursue, certain values. People must tell the truth. And if they do not tell the truth when they are in positions running America's public corporations, then they need to be removed from their positions. It is in the business of promoting transparency. We're talking about companies that are owned by other people. As the executive of an American corporation, you are not managing your piggy bank. You are a steward for other people's monies, other people's careers, other people's livelihoods, and investors all over the world who you'll never meet, whose livelihood and retirement may depend on how you act in exercising your leadership in that company. And so the SEC exists to try and bring American values about openness and integrity to the hurly-burly world of capitalism, and in a way to restrain the excesses of capitalism. So it's a very, very, if you'll pardon, as a proud alumni, it's a very, very noble little agency, kind of a hothouse orchid in the big scale of government, but an agency that has a fascinating mission, one that's always difficult and challenging. Now, I know we like to think of everything being new, but frankly, fraud is not new. The battles we see over disclosure and curtailing excessive compensation and abuses of trust is something that is an ongoing, never-ending struggle. If we lock up every single person at any of the companies that have been in the news who has committed wrongdoing, and if the New York Stock Exchange publishes the perfect and best set of listing standards that have ever been promulgated, I assure you the job is not over. It starts again the next morning. When I took accounting for lawyers over at the law school, my professor told us on the last day of class, by the way, if you forget everything else in the class, please remember that generally accepted accounting principles always follow one step behind generally accepted embezzling principles. And believe me, America's compensation consultants have a tremendous fertility in their creativity, and so you can have the perfect set of disclosure rules, and plans will change, and practices will change, and you have to go and constantly redo it. And there's a bit of a dynamic tension between business and the need to leave business free to take risks and to create businesses that are successful and build wealth, and that's terribly important. Too much regulation can truly kill the golden goose of the economy. But at the same time, too little regulation, too little sense that the cops might be looking over your shoulder, too little worry about your accountants or other examiners who might come in and take a look at what you're doing, can also breed excesses, and they can build up over time. A little nibbling at the, when the mice start nibbling at the cheese, eventually, when no cats arrive, the mice will get bolder and take the whole cheese away. So it's an interesting process, and I wouldn't want to suggest that there's any one set of fixes, as much as there has to be a national mindset about a set of values. So we want to see visionary, bold, risk-taking executives running America's corporations. We want to see America's companies inventing new products and challenging new markets and going out and being the leaders of the business world. That's a good thing and creates opportunity for millions of people. But at the same time, the ends don't justify the means. And we can't ever accept that it's all about the almighty dollar. that there are, in fact, things that are values that have to underlie how we're successful. And that's, of course, why business is, in part, as difficult as it is. So that's a little where I come from.
Thank you. Ken, it sounds as though many of these reforms have been exactly what the doctor or you would have ordered in terms of corporate governance, but I also hear our three other panelists strongly emphasizing that changes in corporate governance to work also require a degree of citizenship amongst investors, a vigorous kind of democracy to make those changes in corporate governance, the CEO's certification of the financial statements, the independent boards on compensation and audit committees, that's not enough. Is it enough, or what needs to happen in terms of changes in our behavior as individual and institutional investors?
Well, of course, it's not enough from my perspective, but I have to reveal conflicts of interest as well. I'm one of the very few people in the United States who work full-time on corporate governance. So it's in my interest to say it's not enough because I can continue to be employed. And similarly, I have to agree with almost everything said, but dissent a little bit from the statement that the problems aren't systematic. There are some incredible problems of fraud that have been revealed that I think are highly unusual, and there were failures there that were just exceptional, such as boards of directors signing off on waivers of their conflict of interest policies, which sound incredible and I think is very rare. Directors getting huge payments for helping to arrange a merger, independent directors, so-called independent directors. That's not something you see very much. But I think there are systematic problems in that our standards became very loose over a period of time. Part of it was that we were in very good times. We were in a bull market. This has happened before. John Kenneth Galbraith of Harvard says that in periods of great growth and prosperity and everybody's doing well, along with that growth, what he calls bezel grows. That's from embezzlement, his coinage. And then things reach a certain point and we have a crisis and the bezel starts going back down. And we're presumably in the stage of the bezel decreasing. It happened before. But to get to your point, I think the systematic changes that Congress has legislated and that the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ stock market are putting in place are excellent and will be very valuable tools to use. But at the end of the day, actors have to fulfill certain roles. And one of those roles is for investors to pay more attention, certainly than they had been in the late 1990s, to be vocal, and actually be vocal on a number of levels, certainly with the companies that they own. I think there's also been a problem that the investors, for a variety of reasons, have not been very vocal with the regulators. Now, we do have a wonderful system, and I agree entirely with Chairman Breden. Not only the SEC, but our securities laws are just extraordinary and a major reason for the success of our markets. But investors can't just leave it to that. They do need to look at their, act as owners and look at the boards of directors and so on. And the boards of directors need to be active. Now, maybe motivated by investors. Unfortunately, I think there's some motivation from fear of litigation, which is not maybe the best way to motivate, but we need very vigilant board of directors, particularly, for example, on the compensation committee of the board. I don't see legislative solutions to executive compensation. I think the key has to lie with the board of directors, or else there is no answer to it. The board of directors is in a position to push back, to negotiate. The problem is learning how to be a director or a group of directors, because the board is a collegial body, that can work collegially with other directors and with management, but also courageously and with independence. We want independent requirements, as have been embodied recently, but then it needs to be fulfilled by those directors, and the investors need to take a skeptical look at what their companies are doing.
Great. It's now your turn. We have microphones on the floor on either side, and halfway up, the salmon runs to the second floor. If you'll identify yourself briefly, pose a question, not a speech, and limit one per customer. We'll start right here. Okay, we're just going to get you some volume. Go ahead again.
My name is Kelly Fujioshi. I'm a graduate of the Kennedy School, and this question is for Senator Corzine. David Nyan, a former Boston Globe columnist and former IOP fellow, last spring commented that the Enron debacle was as much as a political scandal as it was a business scandal, to the extent that many politicians are obviously ensnared in the massive amounts of contributions that Enron gave to them. Could you comment on the degree to which you feel that the Enron scandal is a political scandal?
Well, first of all, I don't think anyone would dispute the observation that American business is entangled in the political system and tries to express its point of view and influence the direction of public policy. The fact is that without WorldCom coming on the heels of Enron and Tyco and Martha Stewart and having an explosive blow-up this spring, the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation wouldn't have passed. It was dead in the water due to an extraordinary corporate resistance and lobbying against the movement of that legislation. And so to that extent, Enron was a very aggressive player in trying to shape public policy. Do I think it's a political scandal? Well, I think that the whole issue of campaign contributions and the role of money in politics is a scandal, but I'm not sure that Enron is particularly unique, might be more extreme than other players with regard to it, but the idea of trying to tie that to one party or another, or a specific charge of scandal in a way other than in the broadest context, I wouldn't go so far. I do believe that Enron is the epitome of the sophisticated fraud upon what corporate activity is about. It's one of the reasons that you've seen so few indictments and it's taken so long to parse through this. It's a very complex, detailed, and unfortunately intelligent formulation of a fraud, but it's nevertheless a fraud. But I think those two are separate. The intertwining of politics and money and corporate money, I think, is another issue.
In the interest of engaging as many of you from the audience as possible, we're just going to move directly to the next question.
I'm David Wilson, a student at the college. This is a question for the entire panel. I was just wondering what role you feel the youth of America have in restoring financial integrity on Wall Street.
Ken, why don't we start from your end, if you've got an observation?
Well, I think there have been some references, but to the extent that you are participating in these systems, Catherine talked about the need for accountants. The need is greater than ever for people in those fields to come forward, train themselves, and really have an ethic, a public ethic that may have been missing to some extent over the last decade or so. And not just there, but I think elsewhere, people need to think very consciously about bringing their values to bear as they work into business careers on whatever level.
Richard?
Yeah, I would just emphasize values. When I was at the SEC, I had we put behind bars and threw out of the securities industry in the insider trading scandals people who had degrees from Harvard, Columbia, Stanford, Wharton, you name the best business schools in America, the best colleges. So there was nothing about fraud that necessarily respected where you got your degree and what your personal background had been. It's terribly, terribly important as you prepare yourself for a career in business to don't forget the values. Your ethics are one of the few things that you get to decide about yourself, what you'll do and what you won't do and where you'll draw lines, and don't ever stop asking yourself what's right and what's wrong.
Your reputation is the only thing that you will be able to, I think, distinguish your career. I think that's, as Richard points out, is the thing that you will develop throughout your career. And it will hopefully serve you well. I think from my perspective, the most important thing for students to think about is that you will be presented with ethical challenges. It is a real-life, true fact that you will be presented with them. And to the degree that you can spend time now thinking through some of those challenges, I think it will be time very well spent. I was reading an article coming here saying that talking about the University of Michigan had 438 students entering the business school, and they asked everyone to write up the ethical challenge that they could most clearly remember in their business career. And all but 3 wrote up something for the first day of class. So I'm just reminding you that you will face them, and I hope that you have the opportunity to spend time on both ethics and thinking about your career.
I think that as your life unfolds, the world sometimes seems more complicated, but I think Richard said it right. Right and wrong is a pretty simple concept. Try to keep that in mind as you face these things. I think youth has the ability, because of some of the unfettered experiences, to challenge those of us who are in different positions in our chronology to hold to standards, and you need to speak out on it.
And even in this tough market, I'd recommend that you only work for a firm where you feel good about the guy or the gal at the top and how the values infuse or are aligned within the company. And I don't want to embarrass the senator or give an institutional endorsement to the firm that he used to lead, but Goldman Sachs offers a day of community service a month for all of its employees. During its initial stock public offering, it distributed shares to janitors and secretaries, not just senior partners. And it's gained a reputation for being very risk-oriented in its philanthropy. Doesn't make it an ethical firm, but I'd look for some signals that the firm gets it, because it's still a seller's market when it comes to values and ethics. On the riser.
My name is Marina Simone, and I have a question to the whole panel. What happened to the Americans saying, buyer beware? If you went to the store and you bought a jacket and it happened to be not made in Italy as it claims, but for example in China, you wouldn't go and sue neither the salesperson nor the CEO of the corporation. You know, when you fly on a plane, you don't tell your pilot how to fly the plane. You trust your pilot to whatever extent you choose to. Why do you want to go into corporate America and tell the CEO how he should be compensated? Isn't it a free market? What's a free market then?
Richard?
We have a free market, although I'll give you a free market example. I happen to be the court-appointed monitor at a company called WorldCom. The second day I was there, I discovered, this has been reported in the press, so I'm not disclosing anything I should, but I discovered that the then CEO, a man named Evers, had given a corporate jet, a Falcon 20 to be exact, for those of you who are fans of corporate jets, a very nice one, had given a corporate jet to the head of the compensation committee, who in the ensuing year approved payments to the CEO of about $418 million. That little transaction was not disclosed to the rest of the board, who was relying on the chairman of the compensation committee, who was recommending things. So I think, in the immortal words of Ronald Reagan, trust but verify.
That is the problem, by the way, that the CEOs, to a substantial extent, have large influence over setting their pay packages, and that's why there has to be some control mechanism.
Yes, here.
Hi, this question is for Ms. Kinney. You had said that you felt that the reason things had taken so long to come into the public eye was because that people were blindsided. Considering how long government and business have been intertwined, and how, how close the politicians and people like you on the New York Stock Exchange have known about, how closely they know these business people, that may strike some people as a bit disingenuous, saying that you were blindsided. How do you respond to that?
I don't think that we were necessarily blindsided as much as the point I was trying to make is that sometimes things that you might not expect to happen could happen. And in the case of a number of these corporate scandals, I think that they are on the extreme. There has been a long history of governance that has gone on both at the New York Stock Exchange and at the SEC. And from the SEC's perspective, disclosure has been at the center. And certainly at the New York Stock Exchange, even going back to 1998, we put in place the adoption of independent audit committees, and that was following some other things that happened, waste management, Sunbeam, some other corporate issues. So I think, back to Richard Breden's point, I think that corporate fraud has always been around. I think we just keep focusing on the checks and balances that we're putting in place and focusing on how those checks and balances are operating in both the corporate environment as well as the board environment, and trying to balance that with the free enterprise system and giving corporations and their executives as much freedom as possible to exercise their own creativity and management over the corporation. So, these things tend to come to us from time to time, and each time they do, we are more or better informed about the kinds of checks and balances that need to be applied.
Thank you. Here.
Hi, my name is Maurice Jolson. I'm a Master's in Public Administration candidate. My question is for Senator Corzine and the rest of the panel. Just basically, what do you see as the role of investment banks as far as what are the current reforms that are being done within them, both by Congress or what can be done by the investment banks? Just, I am a bit skeptical that shareholders themselves have enough knowledge to really provide oversight of companies. I see that kind of as the role of the analyst and of the financial advisors. So what can be done or what is being done to increase objectivity and decrease the conflict of interest between research analysts, financial service and advisors, and investment banks?
Well, there are some steps with regard to regulation that the NASD and the New York Stock Exchange have talked about with regard to analysts. There'll be further rules unfolding with regard to initial public offerings and underwritings and some of the conflicts that are embedded within the investment banking activity. But in my view, investment banks that let their conflicts dominate how they interface and give financial advice and operate in markets ultimately will lose their client. They will be challenged by the marketplace. I do think we need rules. We need, as I said, I'm a big believer that there's plenty of basis for checks and balances. But ultimately, the marketplace, the TIAF-CREF, stops doing business with people who give advice that is for their own self-interest. It's a combination of the sort of libertarian view, which I'm not advocating in its purest sense, with the checks and balances. And I think we've gotten away from that. I mean, there's in the Greenspan view of infectious greed and competing to the lowest common denominator of what is appropriate behavior in these periods of enormous wealth and creation and opportunity, I think degraded the quality of how people dealt with their standards of application in investment banking business. And there's no one perfect in that, by the way, including my old firm. I think there are degrees, though, of how different institutions operate in those elements, and I think it starts at the top. It includes the boards of directors. It's how you hire and reward people, and you need to have policies that are very strict about those, and you need to practice them in the business. So it's self-help on one hand with some checks and balances in the system, and I think investment banks have a major role to play in challenging these things, because you have experts that actually should be able to tear apart a balance sheet and understand what's going on and convey that information to the public.
Let me follow up that concern by asking you, Richard Breden. You talked about the context in which the SEC was founded during the New Deal reforms and how wise it was to base it on the values that should be now sustained. Another piece of legislation enacted at the same time was the Glass-Steagall piece of legislation, which separated commercial and investment banking. In retrospect, were we a little too imprudent in tearing down Glass-Steagall during this period of irrational exuberance and rampant greed?
Well, that's a good question. I think there's, it's actually been interesting to me listening to the congressional debates and the policy debates about legislatively separating accountants' auditing practice from their consulting practice. And I thought, there's Glass-Steagall. You know, I think there is a natural reluctance in government, particularly among those of us who are acutely sensitive of the ability of government to be overly rigid and create rules that are overly broad. And a large trick in regulation and regulatory policy is how to have enough regulation to get the core job done. What is the real harm you're trying to prevent, but then don't go beyond what is necessary and start creating massive economic costs that come from excessive rigidity. And so Glass-Steagall is an interesting example of a case where over the decades, after incessant lobbying by the banking industry, it was concluded that we ought to let the free market roll, and
it did.
Not arbitrarily separate investment banking from intermediated lending. There is a giant risk of the thirst for credit and the conflicts that are inherent if you are a lender of selling stock to enable companies to be able to repay your loans. And I think that our optimism that we could control those conflicts by case-by-case enforcement and rules probably may prove to have been excessive. And I think over time we're going to have to look at the issue of the temptations in credit allocation and how much it impairs the investment banking.
Thank you so much. Yes, here.
Yes, Lance Bruno, graduate. I guess I'm just going to give what I perceive as a solution. I'd like to get some feedback on it. Rather than give a slap on the wrist to some of these corporate crooks, criminals, why not just treat them like drug dealers and basically have forfeiture of all their assets based on the fraud and seize everything? And I think basically if legislation is passed that provides that, I think rather than just signing off on some spurious piece of paper stating on how honest they are, I think you're going to eradicate probably 95% of the problem. Why hasn't there been something like that done?
First of all, I think that the legislation that's been passed is almost piling on with regard to sentencing. Frankly, I think it's almost misguided in the sense that we've talked about lengthening sentences as opposed to putting minimum sentences down where people would actually go to jail as opposed to being able to argue their way out of the length of sentences. I think disgorgement of wrongfully attributed earnings is an enormous positive. It's the same thing that I think one feels about if you're going to have options, you ought to hold them for a long period of time before you cash them in. You know, there are a whole series of these kinds of steps that I think will give greater reflection and judgment to and pause for those who will cheat. And as is said, we're never going to eradicate cheating and stealing and all those other bad things that have been going on since the time immemorial, but if you can put some reasonable checks into the system, I think these are one of them.
Why can't you just seize what they've acquired under a fraudulent basis?
Well, you know, we do have a constitutional system here that you're innocent until proven guilty. Yet there is a desire to do that, but it is also a desire and I think a value of our nation to make sure we do things by the rule of law and evidence. And I think that process needs to be gone through. In Chairman Breden's period in time, it took a long time, but some of those people from Wharton and Harvard and Chicago and other business schools actually ended up going to jail. And a lot was taken, and maybe more should have been, but it's a very solid proposal.
Just a 15-second postscript. It's always easy to it's hard to find an opponent sometimes when you're making the argument, throw the book at them, but I agree with the senator on we have to remember the Fifth Amendment and some other important parts of our values. I do think it's worth noting that the Sarbanes-Oxley bill that was passed by Congress this term, and fascinating the senator was saying it was dead in the water from what anybody could tell, was a really good piece of law. And sometimes you can be cynical that these issues are tough to grapple with and to legislate against morality, but I really think in sentencing area and disclosure and oversight of accounting and a lot of other areas, it's a bill that actually over time will give the SEC great tools and be a good step forward.
Thank you.
My name is Breden DeMay. I'm a senior at the college in the Social Studies Department who would have loved to work for the SEC this summer. Were they willing to accept undergraduates? My question is for Senator Corzine about something you mentioned. You mentioned that CEOs need to start practicing what they preach and pay more attention to people and less attention to earnings per share. And I was wondering why you think there has been a greater emphasis on earnings per share and on stock performance to the exception of people. And if the answer is that the adage that if you are good to the customers, then the customers will come. If that turns out to be wrong, then there is a systematic failure. So I hope that's not it. So I was wondering what you think the reasons are that we have progressed to this stage where incidents.
Well, I think some of this is cyclical, quite honestly. We've gone through these periods in history where greed overwhelms fear, and you get focus on so-called value creation, which is just another term for money. And I think that the 90s saw way too much emphasis on financial values as opposed to a composite value of what you were trying to do in a corporation. And frankly, it spilled over into individual actions, and I think you've seen a deterioration in those values that we've all spoken about and I think are so important to remember. And again, that's why I think there is a role for government and for democratic values to be expressed through the ballot box that puts checks and balances, that try to emphasize more than just financial reward, more than just the economic system. It's part of the answer to the young man who asked about just take their money away and take all. We have values with regard to how our judicial system works. We're a country of laws, and what we lose or what they lose at a given point in time can be a loss of our values. I think we've done that sometimes.
Grady Hedgesbeth, MPP, 1980. My first part of my question is for Chairman Breden, and it is, what is the proper role of the whistleblower in our regulatory scheme? And then for the senator, is there anything legislatively we can do to better protect whistleblowers?
Well, I'd like to define whistleblower very broadly. It's terribly important. The SEC gets a ton of leads from probably two most common sources are the press and sources from within companies where people see something going on that's wrong and they pick up the phone and they call somebody on the staff of the commission and they start an investigation. It was one of the many tragedies of the Arthur Andersen and Enron situation that when the shredding parties were going on, I mean, where were the people with a conscience? Why wasn't somebody on the phone sooner? And so whistleblowing is very, very important. It's always hard in a large organization. You have to respect authority. Companies have to run with a certain sense of direction, and managers have to be able to give instructions to subordinates. But if you're ever asked to do something that you believe violates the law or is inconsistent with your fundamental sense of ethics, the best companies will typically have internal ethics offices or people that you can go to. Usually wrongdoing in corporations is centered in a pretty small group of people, and there will be a lot of honest people on the board and elsewhere in management. So go both to internally within a company, and don't be afraid to go outside the company if the need persists.
In the Sarbanes-Oxley bill, there was actually protection for whistleblowers, and I think there have been similar elements in SEC regulations that go out of the way to protect that. Again, I think this is a combination of what's done in the private sector, as Richard's talking about. I think companies need to have phone numbers that people can call anonymously, but you also have to realize that can also be disruptive in an organization. But I think a number of these kinds of initiatives, internal whistleblowing opportunities, actually do provide the checks and balances internally to make an organization stronger.
Before concluding remarks, we're going to have time for just 2 questions, so quickly, please, here and there.
I'm Chuck Hill. I work for a financial services firm called First Call. In the interest of full disclosure, I am a graduate of that well-known Eastern Business School across the river. I was a sell-side analyst from 1970 to 1988, and I have testified 4 times so far in front of Congress on the analyst conflict issue. My question is, what I had said in that testimony was that we'll never rebuild the wall between investment banking and research until research can stand on its own 2 feet again economically. You gotta follow the money. And we can put in all the rules we want that analysts should behave ethically, but as long as they know that a significant portion of their compensation is coming from the investment banking side of the house, the conflict's still going to exist. What can we do about trying to get back to research being able to stand on its own 2 feet?
Well, I think there are a number of proposals that the markets, the SROs, New York and the NASD have put in place to try to address these issues of separation between investment banking and research. And one of the areas, as you rightly point out, is compensation. And we have been talking about and working with the SEC on proposals that will establish compensation committees that will be independent of investment banking and research and try to focus the compensation of the analysts in an independent way, away from exclusively the investment banking influence. I'm sure there is more that can be done in this issue and in this area of conflicts of interest. I think more will be done. There are rules that are out there now that the investment banks are working to implement, and we have the 2 SROs and the SEC doing examinations of each of the investment banks and how effective they have been in putting these in place. But I think you're going to see more because I think your issue is well taken.
Yes, the last question, please.
Yeah, my name is Anthony. I'm a graduate student at the law school. The Enron WorldCom failures have been characterized in some sense as storms, more or less, as opposed to systematic failures. And that has been confirmed here tonight by one of the panelists. My question, isn't Congress and indeed the regulators sort of overreacting to isolated incidents that foreseeably would flow, from the market forces? Because I think some of the explanation for the massive growth that the U.S. economy has experienced more or less derives from the laissez-faire systems that you have in the U.S.
Thank
you. Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody want to take that one on? Isolated, Richard, you're in the belly of the beast there in WorldCom. Is that an isolated one?
Well, I think if you ask the question, is severe criminality of the kind seen in Enron, Adelphia, perhaps WorldCom, I think is unusual in American business in the broad span of 17,000 public companies. However, I think very aggressive accounting practices and unjustifiable manipulation of reports and unwillingness to admit that things aren't going as well as you'd like them to be going is quite common in American business. And That doesn't mean that it's criminality. It's a little question of degree. We used to sit at the SEC and you could plot GE's results with a ruler. And you know, life isn't quite that stable. There tends to be an awful lot of volatility. And so every company probably manages their numbers a bit and tries to hold back some reserves and tries to do the best they can to put a good face forward. So I think part of our job is to have a system that recognizes and is effective at putting limits in place that says, yes, there's certain things, judgment calls in accounting you have to make, but at some point you reach an area where you can't keep a straight face and where the board and executives have to play a role in being able to say, stop, and there have to be limits. And the one final note I would say is there's a lot of concern, and people ask, you know, did Congress go too far and did we do too much in response to these scandals? And I would emphatically say no. I think the biggest risk we have is that American business will say to itself that it's only one or two bad actors, and the biggest risk is that the business community will do too little to clean up the real problems we've seen.
I'd just say there is I'd clap to that too, by the way. Go ahead. You know, there is a major misallocation of capital that went on in the latter half of the 90s. And to not recognize it, whether it's because of option accounting or pension accounting or overblown perspective with regard to dot-coms and new valuations and new economies, that has ended up hurting the American economy. It's hurt individuals, both retirement and employees, and I think it would be a very real mistake to say that the kinds of things that have unfolded haven't had real impact on real people and have real impact on the long-run health and success of our economy. Hopefully, it's not a fatal one. I don't think it is. I think actually corrective action has been a pattern of American economic response to these kinds of crises, and I think we've done that very effectively.
Ed Koch, when he was mayor of New York, used to say, how am I doing? What I'd like the panelists to conclude with quickly, beginning with Ken Birch, is how are we doing? What grade would you give us in terms of reforms and actions that the Congress, the SEC, the industry, corporations have taken? And the second and more thoughtful question I'd ask you to posit is, looking back 5 years or 10 years from now, what's the single thing you think we're missing most that we need to emphasize going forward to avoid the kind of crisis of confidence that we've recently experienced? How are we doing?
Okay, I'd give a high grade to Congress and the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, on the reforms that they've undertaken. I think the Sarbanes legislation is, I agree with Chairman Breden, really a remarkably good piece of legislation and not excessive. I don't think we have gone overboard, and when a freight train goes through Congress, you sort of worry that something will happen. So there I think we're doing real well. But I think the real world place where this will be dealt with is on boards of directors and in relationships between shareholders and the companies. And there I would give a pretty poor grade. And the issue I would focus on at the moment, and there's a lot of talk about it, but I don't think we're quite grappling with it yet. Actually, I'm going to name a second issue, but first is executive compensation. We went through enormous changes in executive compensation over the last 10, 15, 20 years, and I think it really did have big impacts on the motivations and the courses that companies went through. And I think we need to find a way to grapple with that, and regulatory solutions are very limited or even counterproductive. I should mention the second thing. A gentleman was speaking to me before. We have a systematic problem of investors engaging with the system. Investors basically don't very much. We have absent owners. I don't think we're fully grappling with how to deal with the ownership components of a diversified shareholder base that we have in American companies.
Thank you very much. Richard Breden.
Well, I agree. I think we have a great Congress and great regulators. I think the areas where we need a lot of work are in the boardroom. It's one thing to have rules about having independent directors, but I serve on a bunch of boards, and let me tell you, looking at a CEO who likes to think they run the show every day, looking them in the eyes and telling them no, is something that takes some backbone. And it's more than just having people who have good resumes. It's making it possible for people to spend enough time to understand the company of which they're a director and who have enough stature in whatever field of life they come from that they are not willing for a few options or a few dollars to put at risk their own reputation and are willing to give a CEO their best opinion, not necessarily what they think the CEO wants to hear. Conversely, I served as the CEO of a public company for a couple of years, and the number one thing I looked for in directors for our company was people who I thought would tell me what they really thought. And I think we have a long way to go to make sure, and I really think making sure that the voice of the institutional investors is heard more loudly is a good way to help institutionally propel this. But I think we still have a long way to go in improving a good corporate governance system, but making it stronger in the boardroom.
Thank you. Catherine.
I would say that we're doing well thus far, but I think with any good plan, the implementation of all of these provisions, we still have work to do. The Sarbanes-Oxley bill has presented the SEC with some work to do. It in turn will present some work for the New York Stock Exchange and the self-regulators. So I think we have to stay very focused and vigilant on excellent and flawless implementation, and then the same kind of oversight that all of these provisions are carried out in a way that, again, invites, as Ken said, shareholder democracy and involvement in the running of the companies. You are the shareholders. The boards sit there in stewardship to the shareholders, but this is work for everyone to be engaged in, particularly if we want to, as a nation, continue to have 85 million individual investors and then people who are engaged in 401k plans and a variety of things. We all own this, and we have to step up to the responsibility of ownership.
I think we have an issue of execution. I think other than maybe dealing with options, and FASB should do that in a relatively expeditious manner. Congress shouldn't be writing rules. Some reform in pension work, which I think is really quite substantial, actually is an area that butts into this arena that we've been talking about tonight in a pretty substantial way. And I mean more than just 401k pension activity. There's work to do. But I think that given the fraud, the corporate abuse issue, the response has been sensible. I've, again, conflicted, but I think has been appropriate. And now we need the leadership of CEOs, boards, and participation by shareholders to make a real difference as we go forward. Execution needs to accompany the strategy that's been laid down.
We've covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. I, for one, got to ask only half of my questions, and I know there are many more out there. So we ultimately only scratched the surface, but we did it with the help of 4 very engaged and talented experts. This is the kind of business that, under Professor John Ruggie's leadership, the Center for Business and Government engages in every day here at the Kennedy School through teaching, research, and engagement, trying to reconcile the efficiency of markets with society's demand for equitable outcomes through a process called politics that engenders a degree of confidence, trust, and legitimacy in our institutions. So I recommend those of you who are interested to stay involved with the school and the Center for Business and Government, and to certainly please join me in thanking Ken Birch, Richard Breden, Kathy Kinney, and Senator John Corzine for an informative discussion.